Hello, I'm Naomi, I'm a singer who sews, and today I'm going to show you how I made a Tudor-inspired kirtle for everyday history bounding using a duvet cover I found at a thrift store.
Pretty much as soon as I bought this fabric, I washed it and dried it and opened up all the seams. It had been sitting on the shelf ever since, so it needed a good press. As I was ironing, I noted some weak spots in the fabric as well as a small stain. Since this duvet has a fantastic border print, the first thing I wanted to do was to make sure I set aside skirt panels. I measured the length against an overgown I had made a couple years ago and cut around the flaws in the fabric. The border print repeats, so I cut with pattern matching in mind. I didn't think to cut at the same point in the pattern at each end of the panel, so one panel ended up a little wider than the other, but that's okay because I can just use the wider panel for the back of the skirt for a little bit more fullness. I had limited fashion fabric, so before cutting the bodice out, I started with a mock-up using the pattern I had drafted back in 2020. So this is what I'm starting with. Still fits fairly well, I just have a couple of things that I need to adjust. First of all, you'll see that this shoulder strap is curved outward, and I've even already straightened it up a little bit, but I'm going to make this straight up and down. I am going to leave the back mostly the same. I might take it in a little bit at the side back and extend the length of this here because the middle back sits about an inch high and one of the sides of my hips sits about half an inch high. So I'm going to adjust it for my low hip and then trim back for my high hip. I want a little bit more fitting under the bust, so I'm going to curve in a little bit here. I'm going to extend this into a point in the front rather than curved off. After all those alterations, I cut out a mock-up in white duck canvas. I used these lacing strips so I wouldn't have to put in eyelets and then have them in the wrong place. I've been wearing my mock-up for about 30 minutes, and here's what I am noticing. First of all, there's a big old crease right here, which tells me that my bodice is too long. So I'm going to need to shorten it by, I think, about an inch. And you see that this is really nice over my beautiful belly here. I've also stuffed under my boobs a little bit because one of my complaints about my other dress is that my boobs sink down. So I have like a little triangle here. So if you notice on the back, this side seems to be right at about the right height. This side is a lot more wrinkly because this is my hip that goes high. So I need to adjust for that and probably take out a quarter to a half of an inch. Look how nice that looks now. If I lace this up all the way, my mid-back complains. So it's too tight here at the bottom. I probably want to scooch the side seams back just for aesthetic. So I may actually leave this bit here and then curve it out here and add a little bit more to the front panel. And the last thing is my straps are way too wide. I need to make them a lot narrower. I redrafted the paper pattern and traced it onto my existing mock-up, then made the adjustments. Here's the result. From there, I just needed to raise the right hip a tiny bit more, and I decided to lengthen the point in the center front. Once I was satisfied, I went ahead and cut a second interlining piece from the canvas. I had to sort of piece it together because I didn't have enough fabric to cut one piece, but that's okay because piecing is period and also just thrifty, right? At this point, I pinned the interlining layers together, making sure to keep my asymmetrical pattern pieces oriented in the right direction. And I added a third layer along the lacing edges for strength. I traced out some guides about half an inch apart and quilted the interlining by machine, starting from the center and working my way outward. Then I cut into the remaining fashion fabric, lining up the neck edge with one of the stripes. You can see I didn't have room for the shoulders to be covered, but I had planned to cover the straps with vertical stripes anyway to imitate border trim, so it wasn't really needed. I'm using a lot of the same techniques that Samantha of the Couture Courtesan used in making her black Tudor kirtle. I'll put a link in the cards and descriptions because it is some heckin' beautiful sewing. I seriously was internally screaming through the whole video with how lovely it is. But anyway, the first step is to base the fashion fabric to the interlining, starting at the center and moving out. Since bodies have curves, I used the edge of my table to kind of imitate that shape. It worked a little bit imperfectly, but I do think it was probably better than nothing. Once it was all basted, I trimmed the interlining all the way down to the seam line. The only place you shouldn't do this is at the shoulder, because that is the one part of the bodice that connects to the other piece. Then I pressed the bodice pieces from the center out before folding the fashion fabric around the inner lining, clipping at the curves. I don't need to clip all the way into the seam line because woven fabric will stretch just enough on the bias. I secured the fabric with a large whip stitch before removing the basting. Since I'll be lining this bodice, it can be a little bit ugly on the inside. I decided to follow Samantha's lead and line my bodice pieces before sewing them together. I used some scrap fabric for the lining, so I needed to piece it together. Once I had built big enough pieces, I cut loosely around my bodice pieces, pinned the lining to the inside of the bodice, and folded in the seam allowance, whip stitching neatly about 1/8 of an inch inside the edge, leaving the shoulder straps free because I still needed to stitch them together and cover them. I marked eyelets by eye in a pattern suited for spiral lacing. I like side lacing to angle down toward the back because it's easier for me to lace myself into, so the front piece had to have 2 closely spaced eyelets at the top edge. I also wanted the dress to tie in back, so I put 2 more eyelets at the bottom before evenly spacing the eyelets in between. The back pieces had eyelets spaced more or less evenly to fit between the front eyelets. If you have mobility issues or prefer fastening in the front, you can make the front and back have the same number of eyelets, with 1 pair closely spaced on the upper front and another on the lower back, and then you could tie it in front underneath the point of the bodice. These are the steps I always use to make eyelets. I punch a hole with an awl so I don't cut any of the warp or weft threads of the fabric. Then I open the hole with 4 to 6 widely spaced whip stitches. I always reopen the hole after this and then stitch around the hole with closely spaced whip stitches before opening up the hole a 3rd time to get it to its final size. I highly recommend hiding the thread between the layers of fabric so that you don't have to cut the thread in between eyelets. With the eyelets done, I stitched the interlining together at the shoulder seams using the shortest stitches my machine is capable of. I cut some strips from my fashion fabric, laying them out over the straps to measure a good length and width, enough to cover all the way to the armscye. I matched the shoulder stripes to the stripes across the bust, mitering the corners, then attached them to the interlining the same way as before. Next, I finished out the lining, starting with the front piece. Finally, the bodice was done, and I started on the skirt. I laid out my panels like this, then folded under the top panel, matching the pattern along the fold. I used this fold as a guide to cut an even seam allowance for some French seams. These can be a little bit tricky with pattern matching, so here are the steps I took. I pinned the panels wrong sides together, matching my stripes carefully and stopping about 9 inches from the top for pocket slits. And because if you don't make slits in the side of this skirt, you won't be able to get into the dress. Then I stitched about 3/8 of an inch outside the seam line, trimmed the allowance down to between about 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch, then pressed it open. I folded the panels right sides together and pressed along the seam before opening it out and making another precise fold. I used this fold to mark the seam line and stitched right sides together. After this was done, I clipped into the seam allowance right where the panels join and ironed the seam flat, with the allowance pointing toward the back panel. Lastly, I folded the raw edges in twice and top stitched neatly. To attach the skirt, I first needed to level the hem from the top edge of the skirt panels. To do this, I laid the center front of the bodice onto the middle of the front skirt panel. I traced the bodice about 3 inches to either side of center because I want a flat front on the skirt. After I marked the seam line at the edges of the skirt panels, I divided the skirt and bodice into 4 even sections between the marks. Using my quilting ruler, I marked the depth of the seam line at each point, connecting the dots to create a seam line and trimming a good size seam allowance. I overlocked the raw edge and folded the skirt once along the seam line, clipping into the center point. Then I pinned the skirt and bodice right sides together at each marked point before pleating by eye. I used approximately 1/2-inch knife pleats, some of which are layered over one another, so they're deeper on the inside than they look on the outside. I wanted the pleats to point toward the back, so from the wrong side, they appear to point toward the center front. Then I whip stitched everything together using heavy thread, making sure to catch a decent chunk of the inner lining. I used polyester button thread, but upon reflection, I wish I had used pearl cotton instead, because if the seam comes under strain, the cotton fabric will definitely tear before the polyester thread will break. I attached the back skirt panel in the same way as the front, pleating toward the center back, so from the wrong side the pleats appear to point toward the edges. In the end, decided to hem the skirt since I couldn't get all the creases out of the selvage. At this point, all that was left were finishing touches. I strengthened the skirt panels by buttonhole stitching around the join and creating bar tacks. And I also stitched through all layers of the bodice at the corners of the neck to protect the fabric from tearing. I wanted my kirtle bodice to have as flat of a front as possible, so I made a pillow to stuff into the gap underneath my boobies. I copied the shape of the pair of socks I had stuffed my mock-ups with, and cut 2 identical pieces from the lining fabric. For stuffing, I cut up a bunch of tiny scraps left over from this and other projects. For ease of washing, I attached the pillow to the inside of the bodice using snaps in appropriate places. The pillow doesn't eliminate all of the inevitable wrinkles on the bodice, but it certainly contributes to a historical-looking silhouette.
And then I was done! If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and maybe even donating to my Ko-fi, which is linked in the description below. If you have ever made anything from recycled materials, I would love to hear about it here in the comments, or if you would tag me on Instagram at @thesingersews. See you next time and enjoy the reveal.